Welcome to the Centre for Western Sydney's discussion following the release of the federal budget on the 14th of May. Last time we gathered to discuss the upcoming budget and the key considerations and needs for the Western Sydney region. Today, following on from the budget being handed down last night, we'll be unpacking what the budget means for the Western Sydney region, the way in which it addresses our current needs and considerations, and how to maximise the promises that have been delivered. Again, just introducing to the right, Professor Andy Marks, Executive Director of the Centre for Western Sydney, and Professor Neil Perry, the Chief Economist for the Centre for Western Sydney and in the School of Business at Western Sydney University. And I'm Dr. Rhonda Itaoui, the Director of the Centre for Western Sydney. Thank you for joining us today. I'm looking forward to this discussion, and I might just kick it off with a quick question to you, Andy. As we discussed in our last video, this is an election budget. So before we go to the polls next year, I'm really thinking, does this budget address the needs and the concerns of the Western Sydney region?
It's a yes and no answer, Rhonda. Look, it sends the sort of big picture signals, and it says a lot about cost of living relief. But if you dig a little deeper, and I'm sure Neil will go into this as well, it doesn't really deliver cost of living relief of significant scale, or I guess in a targeted way that the electorate was looking for. Western Sydney's an area that's a bit restless in terms of its voter sentiment, and I think that particularly in southwestern Sydney, in seats that Labor needs to hold, like Werriwa, like McMahon, seats that would ordinarily be Labor strongholds, I think the Albanese government's in a bit of trouble in those parts, and budget measures address that to an extent. But we're talking about really deep structural issues in housing affordability. We're talking about deep structural inequities in wage levels. We're talking about poor access to services, etc., low levels of jobs density, and a couple of, smoke and mirrors tactics in the budget won't address that. They should be, encouraged for measures like the Future Made in Australia initiative, and again, I'm sure Neil will talk about that. But there are other elements in Western Sydney that run deeper than what was announced last night, and I'm thinking it wasn't enough in respect to those areas of really targeted need, and it wasn't enough from a party that wants to portray itself as a party of social equity and economic equity. It just didn't hit the mark.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I guess you did mention the Future Made in Australia policy. Neil, what are your thoughts on what was passed down in the budget, and how might that be able to address some of the structural issues that we've discussed and that Andy's mentioned?
Good question. So I think the Future Made in Australia policy is good as a concept. I think, trying to produce our own green technology in Australia is the right thing to do. I've heard criticisms of it from economists saying that it'll move high valued resources to this kind of sector. Yeah. I'm not particularly concerned about that. I think it's the right thing to do for us to be producing our own energy. I think in the past we've always produced our own energy, but if we're importing solar panels and things like that all the time, we don't have that energy security. So, I think it's a really good thing that we're developing that, and we will become more efficient at it in the future as well. The policy, I think we missed out in Western Sydney in terms of like the big ticket items, like, the hydrogen and things like that, and the solar panel production. But I think Western Sydney can really strategically contribute to it. There's tax credits there to join the supply chain. There's grants under the Innovation Fund and to join supply chains in terms of green technology. So, I think Western Sydney needs to be strategic and become the kind of facilitator really of this Future Made in Australia policy, and bring in, the kind of headquarters into Western Sydney to run these companies, and that'll lead to higher incomes and things like that in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a real opportunity for us to explore this in our Unlimited Potential project, no doubt, in terms of thinking about how local businesses in particular can take advantage of this new policy.
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of big ticket items, the budget provided really big promises for road infrastructure and transport infrastructure in Western Sydney, Andy. What are the wins, and what else is really required to unlock connectivity in the region?
That's a good point, Rhonda. I think we saw some good announcements around support for the Aerotropolis, Bradfield and the airport, but we're not seeing enough scale and commitment around rail and other important connections to and from the airport that are going to support that jobs generation, agglomeration and all of the elements that go into supporting logistics as well. I read a report in the Herald the other week that said it's quicker to get from Campbelltown, I think it was, to the existing airport than it will be to the coming airport in Badgerys Creek by public transport. That's ludicrous. And I think that you're looking for a budget to do things that show restraint and show responsible financial management, but you're also looking for it to send signals into areas of new development. And to me, a new airport comes along generationally. We haven't built one in this country for a very long time, and it was a real opportunity to leverage that up. And they sort of tinkered a little bit around the edges rather than and made those big plays around connections, announcing a solid time frame with the state government, for a rail connection, rapid connections in and out of Badgerys and in and out of Bradfield is a bit of an opportunity lost. Yeah. We'll get there, but I think a government that's looking to address those inequities that we've talked about and that Neil's outlined, when you send big signals, it goes a long way to building confidence, and we just didn't have that. And we have a very young electorate in Western Sydney. Those seats that I mentioned earlier, they're on average younger than other parts of Sydney. These are people whose dreams of home ownership have been thwarted. They're experiencing a lot of social dislocation now over geopolitical factors. There's a lot of tension around access to jobs, access to services, etc. A lot of that can be ameliorated if you provide them something to be confident about. Yeah. And it just didn't quite get there. It remains to be seen whether it'll work for them at the poll. Yeah. But I sense it wasn't enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this really segues nicely to the next question I had in mind around financial strain. And we discussed this in our last video where we discussed the budget, leading up to the budget being passed down. Neil, in terms of the cost of living relief measures, the technicalities of what's been on offer, how do those relief measures really address the needs of Western Sydney? Where have we missed out and how could we do better?
Yeah, I was kind of astonished really with the cost of living measures. I don't really see them as cost of living measures. You've got the tax cuts, which are not about the cost of living. They're about bracket creep and keeping tax revenues, below a certain level for the Australian government. And as we've shown in our report, which is online at the moment, that actually provides more relief to high income families and the higher income regions in Sydney than it does to the lower income regions. And then you've got a $300 flat energy rebate. So everyone gets that, right? This is kind of astonishing to me that, higher income families get the same amount as lower income families. That can't be a cost of living relief. It must in some way be about, keeping the inflation level down because the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is calculated after subsidies. So it must, in fact, be a better way to keep the inflation level down than actually providing cost of living relief. There was rent assistance, Commonwealth rent assistance improvements, which is really important. Western Sydney has many more people on Commonwealth rent assistance and a couple of other measures. But the big things, I just don't see them as cost of living relief.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andy, I know that you've expressed that you were a bit disappointed in those measures. Was there anything that you'd like to add there?
Oh, Rhonda, it's the stuff that the centre looks at really closely, and we have done over many years now. And it is about this, I think, misguided perception that parts of Western Sydney aren't politically engaged. They are, and they will look at acts as Neil's mentioned around a non-means tested $300 energy subsidy as something that's politically cynical and reckless. So it in that context, it can't look like much more than, as Neil's described it, a way to structurally reduce inflation. And people in Western Sydney are increasingly educated. They are very engaged in politics in platforms that might be described as non-traditional. And they see this stuff.
Yeah.
And the tricks that may have worked in the past, both parties, major parties, have deployed them. They're all equally to blame to some extent. they don't work. That budget bag of tricks around, those rebates, etc., and cost of living breaks are seen for what they are. And I just think there's a little bit of a missed opportunity. There is a good signal that government understands cost of living is an issue, and certainly the way they frame the budget shows they understand it. If they understand it so well, why didn't they do it?
Absolutely. And I think, this is a point that we're constantly reinforcing at the centre. We need to have place-based approaches that are based on need. And I think, in terms of one area where the budget attempts to make some changes, on that needs-based really system is in higher education. So I thought maybe we can have a quick chat about higher education. So a really ambitious goal, 8 out of 10 Australians to have completed a tertiary degree by 2050. It's extremely ambitious in an area like Western Sydney, where 27% of our population, around just over 27% of our population, records tertiary qualification attainment, compared to around over 47% in the rest of Sydney. So we're going to need to do a lot to be able to reach that target and be resourced appropriately. So in terms of the changes in higher education, we know there's changes to the HECS and HELP indexation, university pathway program support, prac payments to particular areas. I just was wondering if you both had anything to add in terms of your thoughts on what's been announced and whether it's enough for Western Sydney. Maybe we'll start with you, Andy.
Thanks, Rhonda. Look, it's as you always say, it's where you live counts.
Yeah.
So if they are to hit that ambitious target of really lifting up the levels of qualified Australians, you've got to start in the areas and work on those areas where qualification levels are the lowest. They need to go from the bottom to the top of the queue. That's great for Western Sydney, but it's going to require more than low SES or low socioeconomic status scholarships, or it's going to require more than universities plucking those students out of Western Sydney and taking them into dislocating inner city environments. It's going to require the big universities, Western Sydney Uni, alongside them, coming into those regions of low attainment and coming in at scale. The worst thing that could happen is that people are taken out of their community, and those skills then becomes something that's again contributing to that imbalance in the skills base between east and west of Sydney. Here's our chance to equalise.
Yep.
So it's a great point of leverage for government, but it's going to require monumental resourcing, monumental commitment. And again, this budget was about baby steps. We need to be making leaps.
Yep, absolutely. Yes, how about you, Neil?
Yeah. So just talking about things like the HECS help and paid placements, I think paid placements was really important. That's an area we see our students, they all work basically, and if they've got to do placements, and they could even lose their job by doing that, and that just seems incredibly unfair. And it's an incentive issue as well. Like, students might not want to go into those industries, and we need them in those industries, like teaching and nursing, essential workers. So I think that was a really good idea. The HECS help thing was interesting because I don't know why it was ever tied to the consumer price index. It really should be tied to the wage price index, because it's all about, HECS is about
it's
income
gauged
earning.
on income, isn't it?
It's all
That's
about
right.
Income.
Yeah.
So I don't know why
Income
it was
contingent. It's in the title, people.
Well, it's fundamentally about, education is a public good, but it's also a private good. So you return what you get from it.
That's right.
So it's really about income. So that was a sensible thing to do.
I'm going to flip the lens here, Rhonda. What do you reckon about it? Because I know you've looked a lot in the past at the inequity of graduate salaries for women in Western Sydney.
Yeah, that's right.
What do you think about that in terms of that?
Yeah, so I think what is promising is that the policy reforms are looking at education more holistically. So the pathway programs, I think, are really promising in terms of investment towards those pathway programs. What we have found in our research, particularly around women in the labour force, is that despite around 140,000 women in Western Sydney gaining a tertiary qualification in the last decade, they're participating in the labour force at a much lower rate than women in the rest of Sydney. They're earning significantly less than women in the rest of Sydney. So the return on investment in education is not as high as women in the rest of Sydney. So in terms of really maximising these reforms in higher education, in addition to really, investing in pathways leading into university, encouraging university attainment, we need to think about wraparound support post qualification attainment, and that is, career advice, pathways into employment opportunities that have higher incomes attached to those, but then also addressing those infrastructure barriers that we spoke about. So for women, it's requiring a travel time of an hour each way to get to and from work, and doesn't have meaningful local employment opportunities, and then also doesn't have access to childcare options in her local area, it will impact her ability to participate in the labour force, it'll impact her superannuation in the long run, and it'll continue to entrench the inequities that we have on record. And we do see, this isn't even just a gendered issue. Like when we look at the data in Western Sydney compared to the rest of Sydney, we see that men in the region are earning less than women in the rest of Sydney. So there's really a spatial dimension here in thinking about the return on investment for tertiary qualifications. And if we really want to shift the dial for the residents of Western Sydney, or in areas of where similar levels of socioeconomic disadvantage are recorded, we need to think very holistically about pathway programs leading into, during and following higher education attainment. And this is a great place to start and think about innovating in that way.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. So in terms of those, the policy kind of reforms, some of the different promises that we've seen in the budget, overall, do you have any other comments to add on whether this is enough or how we might be able to maximise those investments? I might start with you, Andy.
Look, again, I think they do understand the nature of the challenge. It's one of those situations where the rhetoric hasn't really matched the actions in terms of what the budget actually delivered. So I think they're playing in the right areas, but they're just not doing it in a targeted enough way, and they're not doing it at enough scale. And I don't know how much the golden sort of goose around a surplus has traction anymore with voters. I wonder whether or not voters in these circumstances, who all carry substantial debt on average, are that wedded to the idea that a government must deliver a surplus. I know politically it's seen as something that needs to happen to have credibility, and Labor are very sensitive to that. So that's the takeout for me. They know what the problem is, but they just didn't dive deep enough.
Yeah, I think for me, I just want to see more industry-based policy that will really benefit places like Western Sydney, just to even up. Inequality is just a big problem in our economy, in our society, and I just think, they have the opportunity here to change marginal tax rates so that they're more kind of progressive, so the tax system's more progressive. They could have moved the future made in Australia policy and have big impacts in Western Sydney, help small business, really scale up and become bigger, and enter global supply chains, bring in that income, change that kind of, even the playing field, basically.
I think it sets it up to be a very interesting election, because we saw the coalition experience major swings against it in the form of the Teals, on the basis of integrity, on the basis of equity for women and other issues, and energy, clean energy. I wonder whether Labor's susceptible to the same kind of swings, particularly in the part of independence in southwestern Sydney. I wonder if this, they may have left it too late to do something about it, because I think issues like housing, like the geopolitical circumstances and social cohesion, I think those factors might really surprise Labor, and they might play out at the ballot box in a much bigger way than anyone suspects.
Yep, I agree. And I know we're very interested in these shifts and really documenting what this is looking like at a local level. So we're really looking forward to, at the centre in particular, developing work around voter sentiment and being able to get a finger on the pulse in terms of our communities and what they're thinking, what their aspirations are, or what, overall, where their vote might end up in the next election. So we're looking forward to tracking that. And, I know in particular, we've been talking about this and Neil. So we're very much looking forward to reporting back on some of that work as well. It's critical that we start to capture this in order to really start to think about the direct effects of these promises and how voters are feeling leading into the upcoming election, how that might be shaping those opinions. So is there anything else you'd like to add before we close off?
No, I think that's really good, Andy.
No, look, great, Rhonda. I think, we're definitely going to do this again next year. That's both a threat and a promise. So I think this
Absolutely.
kind of analysis, though,
Yeah.
in a really targeted way, it's so important. And thanks to you for bringing it all together.
Absolutely, my pleasure. It's been great to sit down and chat with you again, and looking forward to the upcoming discussion ahead of the election next year. So just a very big thank you for tuning in, and a huge thanks to Neil and Andy for providing their insights today. I just wanted to flag again that we do have our issues paper that Neil mentioned that looks at the way in which the tax cuts, or the revised stage 3 tax cuts, do affect Western Sydney residents, and the ways in which the benefits are distributed across the city. So please download our issues paper and read further if you're interested in examining those trends. And I just wanted to also flag that you'll see the centre represented at a range of regional events looking at the impacts of the budget on the Western Sydney region. And of course, as Andy's promised, we'll be back with you next year to explore some of the upcoming trends ahead of the election, and some of our findings as well in terms of Western Sydney voter sentiment. We're looking forward to connecting with you, and please stay in touch with the Centre for Western Sydney for all things related to our region. Thank you.